So let me welcome from the US Department of Energy, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy for Market Development, Climate and Multilateral Engagement. Isabel Munilla is in the house. Come on, big welcome for her here. Great, Isabella, thank you so much. From GE Gas Power, we have the Chief Technology Officer for Europe and the MENA region, Otmane Benamar. Otmane, thank you so much for coming to us. Mary Burce Warlick joins us. She's the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much. And Daniel Schroth, he's the Director, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Department of the African Development Bank. Daniel, lovely to see you. Thank you so much. So you can see here we have a diverse panel that can give us some answers and you know, maybe a few solutions, but certainly some food for thought, because I think we've heard a lot about the issues in the emerging markets and the developing world that we really need to pay attention to, we need to look. Isabel, when we look, I suppose, at the priorities, the programs, the initiatives that go on in the US Department of Energy, talk to us a little bit about, you know, how these priorities, I suppose, you know, help developing and emerging markets in terms of developing net zero pathways.
Great, thank you, Eithne, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and all of you. What an incredible panel before this, incredibly inspirational. I think we've got a roadmap moving forward and seeing a lot of heads nodding about that.
Show me the money, as he said.
Exactly.
Show me the money.
So for the Department of Energy, we're the US Science Agency on Clean Energy. I wanted to highlight a couple of initiatives that we're working on. And again, as Secretary Kerry said, we really want to take advantage of these extraordinary opportunities, and that's our mission. So we have an initiative called Net Zero World. I encourage you to look it up. It's our premier international program and the top international priority of our Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. And so our role as a science agency is to scale new technologies that can increase the efficiency of mature technologies and then take those new technologies to scale in the marketplace. So our goal with Net Zero World is to assemble a broad range of resources from the US government across 9 federal agencies and 10 national labs. And we use these to support partner nations in building their foundations for a clean energy future. So it's a partnership. Our partner nations right now are Argentina, Chile, Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, Singapore, Thailand, and Ukraine. And through this partnership, we're working alongside these partner nations to develop actionable and tailored decarbonization strategies for the key sectors that they select. Right. So our national labs, they put their gold standard technical capacities to work in these partnerships, and they work to identify technological investment pathways to decarbonization. So these are practical partnerships focused on real outcomes. And so I wanted to provide a few examples from our countries.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to say, you know, we've been having a conversation around attracting finance to commercial technologies, correct, or waiting to become commercial technologies. So we bring together, as part of this initiative, US agencies and development banks. So we've got the US Treasury Department, the US Exim Bank, we've got the International Development Finance Corporation, and many others. And the idea is to attract private sector to these initiatives that we're helping to support to really let's get these projects off the ground.
And I think we've been hearing that too, the importance of bringing the private sector, making it attractive for them.
Absolutely.
Because they want a return on investment.
Absolutely.
Without a doubt.
So just a few examples. So with Indonesia, we're analyzing investment strategies, as the Secretary mentioned, to deploy renewable energy while speeding coal plant retirement. With Egypt, we're supporting efforts to add 10 gigawatts of renewables and develop green hydrogen and ammonia. And with Nigeria, we're analyzing the potential for carbon management, methane abatement, and distributed clean energy systems. And in Chile, we're sharing knowledge and best practices on managing the just transition for fossil fuel workers, sharing lessons learned for coal transitions, since that's very important. One other initiative, just very quickly, I just want to flag, is with the Clean Energy Ministerial, and we've got a big moment in July with our chair of Clean Energy Ministerial with India this year. We have what's called the Clean Energy Solutions Center. So we co-lead this initiative with Australia, and what it does is it mobilizes experts to help answer real-world, on-the-ground questions on the path to net zero. So we have an Ask an Expert service where governments that need authoritative technical advice can submit their questions and get service rapidly, free of charge. So just a couple of examples, or just one example actually. The government of Chad asked for advice on options to reach people living in very remote areas with clean and low carbon electricity. They wanted to find out how they could, what options were on the table. So we connected them with experts and provided analysis of solar, wind, biogas, and biomass technology options and costs, and provide a report with examples from countries around the world, scenarios and options. And then we focused on strategies that were applicable in remote areas, which is the solution that they were looking for. So it also included different business models for them to consider and really focused on what their needs were. And this is one of hundreds of examples that I wanted to highlight. And the service has helped already about 90 countries on topics such as the design of feed-in tariffs, clean energy funding plans, regulations, standards, and incentive programs. And I just wanted to highlight just a couple of those examples because there's just real-world help that we want to provide our allies and partners. Yeah.
No, and I think that's hugely important because you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel in every country, I think, and this is something that everybody also needs to realize, that it is also about knowledge sharing, I think, from projects that have already worked, and any help that anybody can give, I think, along the way, and particularly without a cost to it. I think I like that, and I'm sure that's what a lot of other people like. Otmane, when we look at the energy trilemma that we're looking at indeed around the world, and it's impacting, everybody's got to look at that. But a lot, you know, of the challenges, I suppose, and the issues, they're different in terms of emerging markets and developing markets. What do we really need to be looking at, you know, to identify those differences and then to be able to actually help and solve them?
Thank you, Eithne. Power sector is one of the biggest contributor to carbon emissions in the world. So definitely.
But we need it so desperately.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
So it's essential as well. So we have to figure this one out.
Definitely we need to. It's one of the biggest area where we need to focus to solve for the climate change. However, and especially when it comes to emergent market, it's not a simple task just to look after sustainability only. These countries, some of them sees one of the biggest growth in terms of electricity demand, and some of them has already imbalance between demand and the supply, and a lot of them as well have not the right quality of grid to support the introduction of renewable. So when we look at decarbonizing the sector, we need to be careful about the three things, the trilemma that you mentioned. We need to make sure that we can guarantee reliable power. That's important, and we see that a lot of countries in the emerging countries suffer already power shortages. So we need to make sure that we bring that up and make sure that introduction of renewable will not add to the problem.
Yes.
And especially when you have countries where imbalanced between demand and supply, when you add renewable, you need to think about backup because you already don't have enough capacity. So it will add to the cost, which hits the second point of the trilemma, which is the affordability. We need to make sure that power remain affordable, and that even outside of emergent market, if we look what's happening today in Europe, I'm from France, so when we see that people are struggling with the baguette, the price of the baguette, because the price of the power high.
Yes. Yeah.
So imagine that issue is even bigger in the emerging markets because the people cannot afford to pay the same prices as Europe. So we need to make sure that when we decarbonize, we don't add cost. We try to keep it within what people can pay for. And three is sustainability, definitely. So we need, when we add power capacity, because we need to support the growth of economy, which is more demanding with the electrification and so on, we need to make sure that we maintain or reduce the carbon intensity. You know, we will add power, but we would like to avoid adding carbon in the system. So these are the three main points that we have to care about when we are thinking about the energy transition, and especially for the emerging market.
No, absolutely. And I think that issue on cost too, you know, the more expensive power is, it's not just you're paying more for your power, you end up paying more for everything because there's
Correct.
a huge
The
knock-on
baguette.
effect. The baguette, the humble baguette.
Yes.
And people would even love to be having one in many areas, I think, in the developing world at the moment. So lots of issues around there. Mary, when we look at, the work of the International Energy Agency, you're very busy looking at all areas, but you're specifically, taking a focus on, the universal access to energy that clearly it's of key importance. It's the priority on the route to net zero. But there's a lot of great, I suppose, solutions being offered. I mean, we've come up with a few, I think, in the last day and a half. We talk a lot around this. But on the ground, I mean, what's been executed and what's happening? Sometimes I think there's a little bit of a misfit, maybe a lot of talk and not enough action.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to be a part of this discussion today. Thank you to the Atlantic Council as well. I know this subject of universal access to electricity, to energy, has come up quite a bit, and really it couldn't be more important. And I think it's really important as we look at the global context we're living in today, in the context of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the global energy crisis that we're continuing to live with, that the impacts have been felt really by consumers all around the world, not only in Europe, as you mentioned, but with particular impacts on the developing world. And in that regard, we've seen for the first time in a while some backsliding in terms of additional people losing access to electricity, and also backsliding in terms of access to clean cooking. And on both counts, getting back on board, making progress, achieving progress again in both of these areas is really an important component to the broader global challenge of decarbonization and achieving net zero emissions. And again, as I think has been referenced elsewhere in the context of this forum, there are many countries around the world, including many from the developing and emerging world, that have made net zero commitments, recognizing too that, and I know we may get to this separately as well, that there are different starting points for these countries, for countries around the world, and that means the transition may take longer elsewhere. But of course, much deeper, much more significant, really high levels of investment, as was mentioned just now by Secretary Kerry and others, in clean energy and in renewables is going to be such an important part of the answer to achieving universal access. And in and of itself, of course, will help to also address the decarbonization and the emissions reduction challenge. So there's significant gains that can be achieved, and we've really got to focus on this issue of access to financing and investment, particularly in the emerging and developing world.
And I think that can, we're going to hear a lot more on that issue, like right throughout the day. That, I think, has been very much, landed as the key area. And then we work from there. Things get a little bit easier. Daniel, I mean, we've heard a lot, I think, even in the last day and a half, too, about the need for a just energy transition, a fair and equitable energy transition. But also, I think we've heard an awful lot about the challenges, and if we continue doing what we're doing right now, it's not going to happen. So talk to us in terms of particularly the African context. What can we do to make sure that actually there is a just transition?
Well, thank you very much, Eithne, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this important forum. I think if we talk about just energy transition in an African context, we need to be cognizant of two key paradoxes, I would say. I mean, first of all, Africa has contributed, as we know, very little to CO2 emissions globally, historically responsible for about 4% of global CO2 emissions. Yet at the same time, Africa is already bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change. I think a 2021 study of Notre Dame University, in fact, highlighted that the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's quite significant. We're seeing already the effects of droughts, flooding, cyclones all across the continent. And that's also in a context where global climate finance is only flowing very sparsely to Africa. It's only 3% of global climate finance flows that are going currently to Africa. And that's in a context, and Secretary Kerry mentioned it, of the 100 billion that still has not been met by the developed world. The second kind of paradox really is, and it's sort of building on what Mary said from the IEA, is that Africa indeed currently has the largest energy access deficit. We have some 600 million Africans without access to electricity, more than 900 million not having access to clean cooking solutions, with all the negative impact on health, women, deforestation, etc. And very importantly, we're backsliding, as you highlighted. We're not on track to meet SDG 7. And that's obviously contrasted at the same time with an abundance, particularly of renewable energy sources across the African continent. I mean, some of the best solar potential in the world, wind in some of the coastal areas, but also inland, geothermal, the East African Rift Valley, hydropower in Central Africa, etc. So there's a huge kind of a gap, obviously. And so if we look at energy transition in Africa, we need to really look context specific. So in South Africa, which is largely dependent still on coal-fired power generation, with a lot of people kind of being employed in that sector, yes, there is a conversation around energy transition in the classic sense. And that's also why, obviously, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the agreement that was found at COP26 came to about. But if we look at the Central African Republic, if we look at Chad that was mentioned earlier, with energy access rates below 10%, with hardly any generation capacity, you cannot talk about transition. It's about building sort of ideally sustainable energy systems in the first instance. So from our perspective, it's really 5 key priorities that we see. First is a critical importance of planning, building on the best kind of knowledge, information and data that is available, and sort of tapping into resources such as NREL from the labs that the DOE has at its disposal. The second one is really project preparation. We see still many kind of projects that lack all the necessary feasibility studies to allow then institutions such as ourselves to finance these type of projects. A third key priority is really around investments in transmission. I think you highlighted that one of the key challenges to many African countries with very weak, fragile grids is to be able to integrate larger shares, particularly of variable renewables from solar and wind. So there's a huge kind of deficit of investment in transmission, but also regional integration. And then, of course, there's the whole question of how to bring in more private sector investments, de-risking these investments. That's a key focus also of the African Development Bank. And last but not least, obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done on sort of the legal policy, regulatory frameworks that are not yet adequate in a number of countries. Also, I would say...
In a number of countries around the world. I mean, I don't think it's unusual in that area. Otmane, let me bring you in to follow up just on, what Daniel's talking about there. Because when we look at infrastructure, I suppose challenges with transmission and distribution, this is a key area too that, for what you're doing at GE Gas Power, you can actually help this situation here. But distribution, transmission, infrastructure, all of that, one size does not fit all in any country. So how do we resolve that issue? How can we make it better?
I think we need to start acting now. That's number one. And start acting what it is existing, improving what is existing, and that's the short term. And we do have solution there to improve the output, to improve efficiency, improve the flexibility to cope with intermittent sources of energy. And that's on the short term. So it helps really maintaining the assets to serve the introduction of renewable. And we can also improve the efficiency of a lot of countries which are still running with simple cycle power plants, what we call simple cycle power plants with very low efficiency, such as 33%. By just converting those assets to combined cycle, we can add 50% power without adding any fuel. And just as an example, in the GCC, we're talking about 50 gigawatt of simple cycle. So that's, you can add 25 gigawatt without adding any fuel. So you're reducing the carbon intensity, actually, by doing that. So these are some of the solutions that we have on the short term. We have also to care about the grid. Yeah, we mentioned it. I can add to it that because a lot of grids cannot handle the intermittency of the renewable. We need to make sure that there are enough substations. We add digital to make sure that we are dispatching the power the right way. So these are solutions for the short term. Now, these assets will not be stranded in the future when we are decarbonized. We have also solutions for the long term. And some of them were developed with the DOE. So I was talking with my colleague about the combustion in our latest technology, which we call 9HA, has been developed with the Department of Energy to be able to burn hydrogen. And we can already offer solution today which can burn up to 50% blend of hydrogen, which is the best available currently. And we have the path to go up to 100%. We are working also on solution with carbon capture. We're partnering with technology suppliers. We're already selected in few projects, not in emerging countries necessarily, but in the UK or in the US, where we are working on optimizing the solution, integrating the whole carbon capture solution into the power plant to make sure that we continue supply reliable power, but with the least amount of CO2 emissions.
And again, I think the big focus has to be on decarbonizing. Of course, on the road to net zero, and as we go closer to greener fuel and more renewable solutions, gas still has a huge role to play.
Yes, definitely. I mean, we cannot look. I can give the example of Morocco. I'm originally from Morocco. So Morocco has made great progress in renewable. They already today have more than 30% of the installed base, which is renewable. But we are currently in discussion with them on bringing clean fuel, which is natural gas, in some of their assets which are running today on heavy fuel. So that will improve and potentially converting those assets to combined cycle, as I mentioned it. But they are also thinking about adding new power plant with the latest and highest efficiency technology, because that will unlock their ability to reach their objective, which is 52% by 2030. So gas is key to make sure that we can go faster in renewable, but also, again, I insist on the grid. The grid quality is very important to continue introducing renewable.
Isabel, a lot of these projects, I mean, are going to need investment, and I think that was very clear in the last panel. It couldn't have been more clear, where it's like literally was, we need money and we need cash and we need it in the right places. But when we look at the investment in climate, I suppose, and clean energy projects, how will they financially benefit the emerging markets, I suppose, who are actually looking to get to net zero?
Yeah, thank you for that question. From the perspective of our department, I wanted to endorse one of our top priorities is good planning, right? The energy system planning, working to see how these projects fit into that plan, seeing what options are available, that's fundamental. And then second, our view is that innovation anywhere supports progress everywhere. And so that's a fundamental investment strategy for our department to de-risk at a large scale technologies that can be deployed across projects all over the world. And thank you for that mention of your work with DOE. And so for us, really fundamental to a net zero future is reducing those costs. So our domestic investments that we've made recently, billions in domestic energy markets, provide a runway for private investment. And we think this is going to have an impact not just in the US, but in the entire world. And this is part of the US effort to get us back on track to our Paris commitments, right? So just one example of that, of these types of investments, are what we call our Energy Earthshots initiative. Again, encourage you to take a look at those. So these set specific cost targets for linchpin technologies that are necessary to meet climate goals. So, and these are designed to tackle really tough technical challenges and specific cost hurdles related to specific technologies, working with our national labs. And so we have targets for hydrogen, long duration storage, carbon abatement, enhanced geothermal, floating offshore wind, and industrial decarbonization. And so just one example, our hydrogen Earthshot aims for $1 per 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. And we think that this is going to revolutionize clean transportation and industry. And then, to the point on energy, the need for efficiency and reliability and flexibility, we believe that effective storage is obviously fundamental to the work that we're all doing. And so we have a long duration storage shot that aims to reduce the cost of grid scale energy storage by 90% for systems that deliver 10 or plus hours of duration in a decade. So those are just a few of the examples that we think are going to help other countries, especially in emerging markets. And in fact, we've done this about a decade ago. So President Obama had a Sunshot initiative that the aim was to drive down utility-scale solar costs, and it did by $1 per watt to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And so these effects were seen in the US, but then obviously around the world, we've seen solar costs become some of solar has become some of the cheapest and most affordable energy around the world. And this is just a couple of examples of how our agency, in terms of the role that we play, can bring down some of these costs.
And I mean, some great ambition there, but some of these practical solutions, I think, that can make a difference, and they need to be able to make a difference, you know, some of them in the near term, some obviously medium and longer term. Mary, when we look at, and in fact, please be thinking if you have any questions here for my panel. I do believe, where's Shama? Shama's over here. She has a microphone, so catch her eye, and please, if you have any questions, we're more than happy to look at maybe a few specific areas. But Mary, when we look at, you know, mobilizing more energy investment, clearly there's been a huge cry, a call for action in terms of this has to be done. But it's often not easy, and of course the cost of capital is high, and some areas perceived, you know, riskier than others. So people shy away, and they actually, you know, don't jump in there with maybe the eagerness they might in some other areas. How can, you know, what are you working on, and what do you see in terms of how we can change that?
Great. Well, thanks for the question. I'm happy to add a little bit to the discussion in that regard. First, I think just focusing very specifically on the emerging and developing economies, we've seen very encouraging signs, obviously, for many countries in the developed world, from the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, in the EU with the Repower EU and the Fit for 55, in Japan with their green transformation and other initiatives, that in those parts of the world, significant amounts of capital financing from governments are now being dedicated to the clean energy transition, which is wonderful and so important. It's something we've not seen before and really think can be very transformational. But again, if we look at the developing world, we don't see those kinds of resources, and that part of the world has been especially hit by the whole range of crises. Not only the energy crisis, the food crisis, health issues, and so on, in a way that has particularly impacted them. And then you add to the cost of capital, which you referenced, and I think a number of other speakers have mentioned that the cost of capital in many parts of the developing world can be as much as 7 times higher than it is in the developed world for investments in even solar PV projects and things like that. And in terms of what the IEA has done, last year we did release something called the Cost of Capital Observatory, which is basically an inventory that takes a look at what the differentiated costs of capital are. And the next step is
a report that's available, what, on the website?
Yes, yes it is. Yes, it is. The next step, of course, is to analyze this more deeply and see what can be done about addressing this. And I know this was referenced in the last panel as well. There's a whole host of issues that need to be looked at. I'll also add that we had released at the IEA about 1.5 years ago a report on financing the clean energy transition in emerging and developing economies. And so it is a topic that we're really focused on. Just to add that there's a hugely important role on the part of governments and multilateral development banks to continue to provide concessional finance in terms of financing investment for clean energy projects. That in turn, again, as others have mentioned, can really provide an accelerator or send strong signals to the private capital markets, where we see by far the largest source of financing available. And so the work that's being done on what was just discussed with the energy transition accelerator is so important in helping to unlock and provide solutions to some of these issues. But clearly, a really important subject that will need to be continued. And with President Macron's summit coming up in June to look further at the financing issue, that I think will be a really, really important moment for us to continue to dig deeper in looking at real solutions.
And I know, I mean, this is a big feature in Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. We take this conversation from the Atlantic Council on to the next couple of days as well, and some of the big banks are going to be in place as well. So I'll get the opportunity to maybe put a few of these questions to them as well. And clearly, a segue perfectly to you, the role of the development banks, and particularly the African Development Bank. What are you doing on the ground, making a difference, and that you can see practical results coming from?
No, thank you for the question. And indeed, I mean, from our side, we've really been trying over the last couple of years to increase financing flows into clean energy in the African context. I think a good example to highlight in terms of that mobilization effort is our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, which has sort of grown to become one of the largest blended finance facilities for the just energy transition in the African context. We were able to raise over the last 2.5 years, over $300 million in grant contributions for CEFA. But CEFA is a blended finance facility, so we can provide grant where it's absolutely required and necessary, but also to provide concessional loans, take riskier positions in new innovative funds. Just an example, we invested $10 million from CEFA in the first kind of fund that's looking at access to clean cooking solutions, Spark Plus, already invested in 2 projects in Africa. I think these are sort of the type of investments that are critical to unlock more private sector engagement in the energy sector. So that's one example that I want to highlight. Another example more on sort of the larger kind of side of the institution, and I think the African Development Bank, we had sort of been facing some capital constraints over the last couple of years for various reasons. So we were, in a way, forced to be innovative, and we've been particularly innovative, I would say, on some of our balance sheet optimization transactions. So for example, we approved just in October last year a transaction with the UK government, a $2 billion guarantee for a room-to-run sovereign transaction, together also with the involvement of several private insurers, that basically transfers the risk from some of our sovereign portfolio to those institutions. And in that context, it's basically freeing up additional capital that we can invest in projects that are supporting, and particularly sustainable energy, but also climate more broadly.
Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, Daniel, but many people have been calling for, I suppose, a complete overhaul of the development banks. I was thinking there was something odd about my microphone. Okay, we're back in action here. God forbid you wouldn't hear me. Just when I'm asking him that question, not putting you on the spot, but we've been hearing, I mean, that there needs to be an overhaul on some of the development banks. I mean, sort of what, and good you're taking some initiatives, but kind of what's been broken along the way? I don't want you to go too much detail at the minute, we don't have time, but what are you doing to make sure that the African Development Bank, you know, is looking like a reliable, trustworthy, and actually is hopefully, you know, moving the focus in the right direction?
Well, I think first of all, we have sort of really set clearly out what are our objectives in terms of climate. It's one of the key priorities for the bank. We've adopted a policy, a strategy, and also clear action plan with commitments over the next couple of years. We've in fact met in 2021 our climate finance targets with more than 40% of our investments going in climate finance. I think importantly, and we're the only multilateral development bank that has also placed a strong emphasis on adaptation finance, which is, as I highlighted earlier, particularly important for Africa. I think we had in 2021 67% of our climate finance being focused on adaptation. We're championing in that context the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. We're also trying to see how our concessional window, which is the African Development Fund, which is sort of the equivalent of the World Bank IDA, becomes more responsive to the needs of African countries. We had just concluded early December the replenishment of the African Development Fund with record numbers thanks to the donors to the fund, but also now several African countries that are contributing with their own money into the African Development Fund. And one of the examples is we were able to create a climate action window, sort of a dedicated kind of envelope of resources to increase climate ambition, and of course energy is a key priority in that context. So those are some of the examples. There's obviously a lot more work to be done, but I would argue maybe because of this kind of constrained context that the bank has been operating in a couple of years, that we're certainly trying to be innovative, including in terms of making the case that some of the special drawing rights that the IMF has made available are channeled through the MDBs, to use our ability to leverage those resources and be able to invest more in African countries.
And I mean, I guess even almost, you know, looking at your role too, the specialty role that actually has put this at top of the agenda, that's a new shift, I guess, as well.
Indeed, I mean, we adopted a very ambitious strategy, the New Deal Energy for Africa in 2016, which really placed energy at the top, sort of our #1 priority for the African Development Bank, because energy has, as we all know, such a critical impact for development at large. And that also included a restructuring, and renewable energy indeed was one of the priorities that was also then reflected in the new organization.
Again, I think, you know, making sure access to energy is a huge enabler. Did you want to ask a question? Here we have, Shama's got the microphone, and now we've got a few questions. Now we're cooking, always at the last 10 minutes. I think there's something psychological about that.
Hello, I want to thank you all for your contribution and this discussion. I have two questions. The first question is directed to Mr. Daniel, regarding, because one of the main questions that came to my mind during the discussion about energy transition and how that can be applied for African continent, where there is a huge gap in capital finance and all of that. So how you can tackle, like, do you, like one of your strategy at the African Development Bank, is it going from like to go through conventional way of supplying sustainable energy and then go for energy transition, or just start from the, like the last step, to provide energy solutions for poor countries like, as you mentioned, Central Africa and Chad and others. Like yesterday, only Heathrow Airport has energy demand more than Sierra Leone.
Yeah. Let me just answer that first question, and we'll come back to you in a minute. I'll get another question from the gentleman there, and we have time. So please, we need to speed up now because we have a few questions.
Sure, I'm going to be very brief, but I think the first important point is we need to look at each country individually. What is the particular context? So from our side, we're really trying to identify what are the best sort of solutions. And that does not mean that Africa should sort of follow the same path that the West has done. Mm-hmm. So it's not kind of building first a conventional kind of power base and then you transition. So for many of the countries that currently do not have or have very limited generation, I think sort of trying to see how can we from the start sort of use kind of the enormous renewable potential is there to build that up. Also looking at providing access through decentralized energy access solutions. I think a lot of possibilities through green mini-grids, through solar home systems in the very remote areas. I think that's sort of some of the areas that we're really focusing on. And of course it needs to be done in close collaboration with the countries and based on sound planning, as we highlighted earlier.
Let me just bring Mary in on that one there. We look at the policies in the US, the clean policies and the climate goals. They work there, but could they work in emerging markets, and could they do something similar? And I can see Otmane wants to contribute to this as well. Go ahead.
No, great, thank you. I mean, I think what we're getting at here, and it's incredibly important, is that we need to share lessons. And I think for us as an agency, we use the platforms of the Clean Energy Ministerial, we use the Mission Innovation, we have, again, I mentioned it again, I'm pitching this, we have our big meetup in India in July, and that's absolutely critical. We also have our Net Zero World partnerships we talked about, we've got strategic clean energy partnerships, and this is a place where we are able to share the lessons that we're learning about the approaches we take to tax incentives, et cetera. But I wanted to draw our attention a little bit to, when we're thinking about whether energy access or energy transition, for us, workers are extremely important. So I want to highlight a couple of areas where we're sharing lessons with our partners.
We don't have a whole lot of time now, so I've got to speed you up a little bit.
We do not. But I did want to flag a couple of areas, and this is really essential when we're thinking about transition, which is there's worker protections and incentives that need to be put in place when we're thinking about transitioning out of coal, out of oil and gas, and those workers need to be reskilled to supply our workers for the next generation of technologies. And I wanted to flag a couple of policies that we're putting into place. They're new, but we want to share our experiences. We've got expanded energy tax credits for efficient commercial buildings, and it includes bonus credits for businesses that pay prevailing wages and hire registered apprentices. So we want to make sure that companies that promise to pay wages but don't follow through are penalized, and workers who owed prevailing wages will receive the difference plus interest. So, and this is a commitment. We need to bring our people along with this transition, and there's ways that we can, policies that we can put into place. Now, we're testing this right now. So it's essential that we keep up the conversation and we continue to help each other to drive innovation, especially in bringing our people along with the transition. Another one I wanted to flag is that for us, we have clean energy tax credits that are increased by 10% if a clean energy project is established in a community that has previously relied on the extraction, processing, transport, or storage of coal, oil, or natural gas as a significant source of employment. So it's really focused on creating economic development in communities potentially impacted by a transition. So really focusing on making sure that the workers who have been involved in industries that have driven our economic prosperity are brought into the transition, and making sure that our economic and fiscal policies that we're using to drive these new renewable energies, bringing people along. I think from a political standpoint in our country, it's essential.
We got 5 minutes left. I'm going to take another quick question from you, directed to one person. Quick answer. We're going to you, sir, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm really sorry.
Okay. My other question is regarding also the funding available from other, like Mr. Senator John Kerry and others, like Bezos Fund and Rockefeller Foundation. How Africa can take more like out of that fund, because now it is only small portion. As he mentioned, $300 million on only 2.5 through credit from UK.
I don't think my people have an answer for that. You need to chase down our other colleagues on that. Sorry, I'm going to take a question from you.
Hi, good morning. In the previous session, Secretary Kerry was mentioning the top 10 polluters or carbon emitters. One of them is, first is China, followed by US and India. We heard a lot of views from US, but we didn't hear any views from India or China. Is it an aberration, or is it even at the highest level, and is not that a problem?
You know, I want to, as I say, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I think we got to take it care. I want to give this one to Mary, perhaps, and also maybe add into that. I think many of the countries having different starting points in terms of how they're going to manage that. Maybe you can do 2 for 1 there.
Sure, happy to do that. And I will say that thank you for pointing that out. I think all of us here, and I certainly know that governments and international organizations, IRENA included, really all around the world, of course, are in discussions with China, India, and all the many countries where this issue of emissions is among the biggest problem. And the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership that Secretary Kerry referred to, is one of those approaches through which there's significant and deep dialogue about how to take off some of the heavy carbon-emitting coal plants, but also to provide support necessary for investments, new investments in renewables and clean energy. And just segueing to the other point that you mentioned, Eithne, I think as we look at this issue, it's this whole set of challenges. There's no doubt that the issue Isabel spoke to on the importance of people-centered transitions all around the world is going to be very important. How do we ensure that people around the world see the benefits of the clean energy transition, which, and this is another area we've done quite a bit of work, is actually going to create millions and millions of new jobs, but the challenge is, of course, multifaceted, but ensuring that those who lost also have benefits. And second point, recognizing that not all countries, though I think countries around the world really do recognize the climate challenge, and many have committed to net zero or carbon neutrality goals going forward, but not all countries have the same starting point, have the same level of resources, and for that reason, we'll need to pursue different pathways forward as they try to meet their goals. So one of the challenges for all of us is ensuring that they get the support they need, the financing they need, and in some cases that means continuing to recognize too that conventional energy sources, as was mentioned, will need to be a part of the solution for some of the development that's needed.
we've sadly come to that point in our discussion here where we've got to be wrapping it up. Mary, I'll stay with you at the moment. A quick call to action if there was one that, you want to send a message out there.
As I indicated, really think globally about the challenge here. Not all countries, since our focus is very specifically on the emerging and developing economies, have the same access to the financing and the resources needed. Let's really think hard in this year ahead, just as I know the AFD is and others, on how we can unlock not only the public sector, but the private sector financing to support this really important global transition.
Daniel, if there was a call to action for you, what do you think is most urgent right now?
Well, I think just to build on that, I think one is we need to speed up because there's a huge opportunity cost if we don't act now. So we're not moving forward fast enough. We definitely need to scale up, particularly the flow of finance towards emerging countries, particularly in Africa, including climate finance. I've highlighted the percentage earlier. And I think there's also a need to really do more to synergize. There are a lot of efforts from different partners, including ourselves, happening. We're talking to each other, but we're not yet kind of speaking and singing all from the same song sheet. So the synergizing of efforts is also needed to achieve the maximum impact.
Otmane, there were so many areas we did want to touch on. We didn't really have time, forgive me, but I mean, a closing call to action.
I will try to put them on the closing action.
Squeeze it
So as GE, we have solutions for solving the trilemma from wind to hydro to gas and to grid as well. And we are working on developing those solutions to make them fit for the different countries, different regions. We're still improving on hydrogen blends to get to the 100%. We're working on new generation of carbon capture. But where I see a real problem today, which was connected with the financing and answering the gentleman, I mean, we see problems today with some of these emerging markets getting financing because they get financing from institutions based on countries where there is restriction on financing fossil fuels. But fossil fuels in these countries are still decarbonization. So that's a real big problem. Even we see developers shying away from funding, being involved in these projects, developers from Japan or from Europe, because they are heavy on their portfolio on CO2, and they cannot come and play here. So financing is key, and also policy. We need to make sure that local policies are adequate to support the right path to net zero. But also multilateral policies, not only the country policies, but also, for example, the European policy or UN, whatever, that can be set, which may not be fit for these countries.
I mean, very dynamic time in the industry, very challenging in many ways, but all of these issues have to be addressed. May I give you a closing word, Isabel, here to just send us all off? I mean, again, a quick call to action. What can we do, maybe in the short term, that can make sure we're surviving in the longer term?
Well, I'll just repeat what I said before, and obviously you heard Secretary Kerry, who I can't speak for. I think he said it all, but I think we need to help each other. We need to share lessons. There's incredible innovation happening in emerging markets, and we need to draw from those lessons. I'll say it again, we need to focus on our people and our workers and share lessons of how we're going to bring them along, because that political power is essential for the hard steps we need to take next. We need to share lessons there.
Super, thank you all so much. Please, a round of applause for our dear panel here, Isabel, Otmane, Mary, and Daniel. Thank you all so much.